Dr. Reshma Shah, welcome back to the Plant Trainers Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are excited to have you back. Of course, we are super excited about your book that's coming out very soon with Brenda Davis, Nourish, the definitive plant-based nutrition guide for families. And we want to get into talking about so much, but of course, you know that we want you to share a moment of gratitude first.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I'm really grateful for is something that we take for granted, which is just clean, fresh air. We've had a really horrible wildfire season here in California, and between COVID and then having to stay indoors because of the fires, I'm just so appreciative that we can enjoy the fresh air. So I'm very grateful for that.
The small things that we seem to not go unnoticed until it's taken away from you, right?
Yes. Yes. There's a whole new appreciation for it.
So I'm sure that you've been quite busy since number 270. Yeah, 270. And we did talk to you about pediatrics, plant-based pediatrics, raising kids, and we want to get deep into conversation about that today, cover some extra bases, and really give parents an understanding that their children will be okay and what they can do to make it easier and what they need to pay attention to as we go. And I guess the first question that I really want to know from you, what your perspective is why parents should want their children to be plant-based, because I think a lot of people say, I want to be plant-based, but my kids don't have to be. Yeah. So why do parents want their kids? Why should they want their kids?
And that's where we started, right? Like we wanted to be plant-based and we weren't sure if it was okay for our kids. Are they going to get everything they need? So that was something.
Well, I think as parents, we're willing to experiment on ourselves. Like, I'm going to try it and see how it goes. But we're not willing to take that chance or that risk with our kids. And so I fully understand and I can empathize with that. I think the main thing to look at is when you think about why kids should be plant-based, consider why you should be plant-based. And I guarantee you that those same reasons are going to be applicable to your children as well. So that fundamental why. So we know that a plant-based diet can not only promote and sustain health, but it can also prevent many of the chronic diseases. And as a pediatrician, you know, one of the things I thought is, I'm not going to have to deal with like high blood pressure or diabetes or things like that. But we know that some of these chronic conditions are beginning in childhood, even if they don't manifest in terms of onset in childhood. The disease process is beginning to develop. So in terms of heart disease, we're seeing some of these atherosclerotic plaques begin. Autopsies studies have shown that they start as young as age 3, and by age 10, most kids have evidence of some of these atherosclerotic changes. So in terms of health, disease prevention, maintaining health, all those things that we would do for ourselves are also very applicable for children. And I think what's changed perhaps for me in terms of the last time we spoke in this conversation is a growing awareness of how the world is changing around us. And we talked about the California wildfires in terms of the environment and the ethical concerns. And I think there is a collective desire to live within our values and to really have all of our choices be an expression of our values. So in terms of protecting our health, protecting our planet, and in terms of the ethical reasons, I think all of those reasons are reasons we would want to sort of incorporate a plant-based diet for our children. And I think I try to empathize with parents' concerns and meet them where they're at. And so let's talk about the specific concerns instead of saying plant-based diets would not be appropriate for children.
For those of the people watching on YouTube, I was kind of smirking when you were talking about the autopsies showing heart disease in 10-year-olds. And I don't want to seem like I was insensitive, but it always reminds me of the story where I had said that on the podcast once, and we got a letter in from a listener saying, I was listening to your podcast and you said that, children of 10 years old already have heart disease. And I went and I looked it up on Google and it appears that you're right. And I was like, oh, well, thank you, Google, for proving me right.
It's important to clarify, right? So when we say children as young as 10, what the study shows, these atherosclerotic changes in some of the larger vessels. And so they're not having heart attacks or heart disease like we would think of in adults, but that's those are sort of the beginning stages. And this is all based on autopsy studies. And we see for sure hypertension and type 2 diabetes in children. So yes, it is. And more importantly than just thinking about those plaques in the arteries, the thing I like to help parents focus on is that these are habits, right? We all have traditions and habits that we become used to. And the most important thing is that we're creating these foundationally healthy habits for our children. So when they learn to eat this way from a young age, there's not so much undoing when they get older.
And that's what I was going to say. When things are running in the family, whether it's from genetics or whether it's from lifestyle, instead of getting yourself into trouble and spending your 30s, 40s, and 50s getting yourself out, just give them those good habits, give them that understanding. And will they stray from the nest, when they're teenagers or early 20s? Yeah, maybe they will. But if we've given them a foundational start and we've given them knowledge that they can come back to later on, then we're doing our job. And it is our job to teach our children values and to teach them good habits, especially when it comes to food. Yeah.
But do you think that parents are hesitant to do this because of the nutrition aspect or because of the social aspect that the kids would be going through, whether they're at school or with their friends? I'm not sure which one is the bigger concern for parents, because I think they both might be.
I agree. I think they both might be. I think ultimately when you begin the process, it's about the safety issues. I think, if they don't eat chicken, if they don't eat eggs, if they don't eat, tuna salad sandwiches, where are they going to get their protein? I think it starts with a nutritional concern. As they go deeper and they start to incorporate some of these changes, then some of those moments of tension begin to surface, right? Like, well, we've decided to not eat these things, but there's a birthday party and there's going to be pizza, and I don't want my kid to feel left out. The other thing that can happen too is, especially if you've got older children, is you might meet resistance from them. They might not be ready for the change. So I think fundamentally it starts with nutritional concerns and how am I going to meet their nutritional needs? And as they go deeper, some of these social issues and, I'm sure we'll talk about picky eating and all those things come into play. But I think it's both. It's not, one or the other. The other thing is, I think our society, we're taught to believe that it's requires, meat and dairy and eggs and all those things are supposed to be a significant portion of our plate. For me, I grew up in a vegetarian household, so it wasn't such a strain to believe that you didn't need those foods in order to lead a healthy life.
And ease comes into it too, right? You're going to a restaurant. Well, it's easier to just order off the menu, or it's easier to pick something up on the way to gymnastics. So that plays a part too. But I think that the ease part is we're able to step away from that because it is so accessible outside the house now compared to what it was 10 years ago.
For sure.
And I also think the other thing is, I don't know where this idea comes, but I think that people believe that if they're eating like, meat and potatoes or chicken and whatever, that it automatically guarantees that children are going to meet their nutritional needs. And we know that's not the case. So I think regardless of the diet that you're feeding your children, you need to consider, whether they're meeting their nutritional needs. And just because you include animal foods in the diet doesn't guarantee that you're meeting all your nutritional needs.
And people will say, you need to be so careful when you're plant-based. And my response is normally, well, we always need to be careful. We always need to be mindful. We always need to take a lot of things in consideration. Just some things we've learned and become second nature, or some things we've just learned to ignore. And I think that kind of brings in feeding principles. And I know that there's a whole section in the book on general feeding principles. So what do our listeners need to know about that?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I would emphasize when feeding children in terms of your approach, you're definitely going to pay attention to the nutrients and whether they're meeting, all their vitamin and mineral intakes. But I also like to encourage parents to think about the relationship that they're creating around food and with their children. And so Brenda and I both really ascribe to Ellen Satter's division of responsibility. And for those of you who may not know, Ellen Satter is a renowned feeding expert. We diverge a little bit in terms of her nutritional principles and her nutritional recommendations in terms of food, but her framework for feeding is really the foundation for creating a healthy, dynamic feeding relationship with children. And the basic premise is that there is this division of responsibility. So as parents, we are responsible for the what, the when, and the where of feeding. So we can decide that we're going to have pasta with marinara sauce and broccoli at 6:30 at the dinner table. That's our responsibility. And then children are really responsible for what and whether they eat or not. So you sort of put the food out there and they are responsible for deciding whether they're going to eat it, how much they're going to eat it, and then you kind of back off. And for many parents, this is a really frightening, scary approach to feeding. And I don't think that you can go from, one extreme way of feeding to a beautiful division of responsibility feeding Ellen Satter's approach overnight. It's a gradual process. And you have to sort of trust and know that your children will learn to eat a variety of foods. They'll eat a healthy diet. But the more that we pressure, force, bribe, trick, all of that stuff, not only does it diminish the nutritional quality of the food that the children are eating, but it creates a really tense relationship with your child. So I think that's the basic framework, and every family is going to have to sort of determine where they are and how much of those principles they can incorporate, and at what pace. So that's the basic premise.
So let's play some situational dilemma.
Yeah,
we have pasta with marinara sauce and broccoli at the table. Child wants the pasta and the broccoli, and they're not willing to take the sauce. What do we do?
So there's a couple of different scenarios. So some parents may sort of say, this is how it's made, and that's kind of your choice, and you're gonna have to work around it. Or if you are a family that says, we'll have the marinara sauce on the side and the pasta, and everyone kind of make their own, then that's totally fine. The child eats the pasta, they eat the broccoli. And the key thing is you have to keep offering those foods. So the minute you sort of say, you have to have this in order to have that, or you have to, the child is going to become resistant. And if you keep offering it, maybe the 5th or the 10th or the 15th time, they'll say, maybe I'll try that marinara sauce. It looks kind of good, and you just have to create a relaxed environment around it.
Or they'll just dip it a little bit. I always tell people you need to cut off your emotions. Yes. And even though you're dying on the inside, that you want them to have the sauce, it's got the lentils in it and they need the lentils. Right. You got to not show them the emotion and just say, okay. and let them go.
Studies that have looked at the nutritional intake of children, like if you offer the food and you kind of let them go, that over the course of a couple of days, they end up meeting their nutritional requirements. So always don't focus on that one specific meal, but it's the grand scheme of what you're feeding them over the course of days.
But what happens if you prepare that pasta with marinara and broccoli and your kids don't want to eat any of that? Because they don't like pasta, they don't like broccoli, but that's what's for dinner.
I had someone say to me 2 weeks ago, my daughter had air for dinner last night. And I'm like, good for you for letting your daughter have air.
A couple of caveats. So I will say that we're under the assumption that you have a child that does not have any underlying medical conditions. They're growing and thriving fairly well. So under those normal situations, what I would say is, it's okay. You decided the what, when, and the where, and they get to decide the rest. Now, the other thing I usually recommend is when you're trying new things, or if you're trying a new approach, always have 1 or 2 things on the table that your kid will like, that they will eat. So this isn't about like forcing them into a certain situation or really tricking them. It's about like compassion, right? So you want to, without being a short order cook and not cooking multiple meals for everybody at the table, you want it to be sort of an inviting, calm, loving space. So don't try and trick your child or force them. Make sure there's at least 1 or 2 things. So if your kid really likes whole grain bread or fruit or something, you could, if you're doing pasta with marinara sauce and broccoli, maybe you'll have some fruit or some bread or something that that the child will readily eat and accept. And if it comes that they really are not willing to eat any of it, I think they'll be hungry at that. There's another opportunity for feeding, whether it's a bedtime snack or breakfast in the morning, they'll have another opportunity to eat.
So talking about situation number 3, you have your pasta with marinara sauce and your broccoli, and child eats broccoli, a couple of pieces of pasta, and says, I'm really not feeling this pasta. Can I cut myself an apple? The apple's not on the table.
Right.
It's not something you need to cook or prepare. It's not an alternative meal, but it's an addition to. So where does that fit in?
Yeah, and I think this is where the nuance comes in. So if you're going to be a strict Satter sort of like this is on the table, you're not allowed to go get something else. I think know your child and know your family situation. So if you have a child that's, no matter what you make, they're always going to say, can I go get that thing from the fridge? Then you're going to set up a pattern that's not really working. But if it's like a once in a while thing, so I tend to say there are no hard and fast rules. Like, you have to trust yourself, trust your child. If you think this is going to be in service of creating more harmony and really meeting the needs of your child without sort of caving in, then I say go for it. In our family, we I mean, my kids are older, so we've been doing this for a long time now. We don't do that because there's really no need for it. I I rarely cook something that I know that someone really, really, really dislikes. It's just, there's no purpose in that, especially if I can serve something that people are going to really enjoy. What I always tell parents is, especially when you have older kids, the average American family, I'm sure it's the same in Canada, spends 18 minutes at dinner. And in our family, it's kind of one of the rare times that everyone comes together. We're all sitting together. I want that time to be cherished. So it's not about creating battles and, this is what I said and you can't do this. So if if the apple seems like it's going to serve your child and serve you in the moment, then go for it. But if it's creating this sort of habit that they're always going to go for that extra food, then I might reconsider. I am not a fan of like, go make yourself a smoothie, go make yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, because again, that's a habit you get into.
You're teaching habits.
But
But
I
then
think
there are the times where you try a new food that you're bringing to the table, so you don't know how people are going to react to it, or the occasional time when you make the pasta and realize it's not actually cooked and you don't blame anybody for not liking it.
no, I think
Like things like that happen.
invite like joy and humor into it. Like I've definitely made things where like, this is just not good. And we kind of make the most of it, like try and make the best of it. So I think having some flexibility, and I think the more that you create that sense of structure, the division of responsibilities, scheduled meals and snacks, the more structure you have, the more room you have for flexibility.
There's also a huge difference between an apple and a bag of chips or cookies, right?
Or a grilled cheese sandwich,
Right.
or right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an addition too. And again, what I really emphasize with my clients is that it's whatever you can be consistent with and that you agree with. And if you're going to have this internal fight with yourself, that's a problem. And if you're going to outwardly show those emotions, that's a problem. And if it creates a habit that you don't want to create, that's a problem as well. But if your kid's not going to eat a spicy curry that like you wouldn't have eaten 20 years ago either, can you blame them? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to I always say nutrition, of course, but also compassion and connection with your kids.
Absolutely. So you did touch on, and I wanted to reiterate that it's not necessarily the nutrients that a child is getting every day, but you can kind of add up that nutrients over the course of the few days, over the course of the week. But in an ideal world, what would you like to see children eating daily or almost daily on a regular basis? What kind of foods should be included or ingredients?
Yeah, and so it's going to vary a little bit with the age and stuff. But on our website for the book, it's called nourishthebook.com. And on the resources tab, we actually have created a plate. So you can just go to the website, it's there for free. And it's kind of a visual of what our plate should look like. So all the spectrum of plant food. So, balancing carbohydrate. Brenda and I are not proponents of, this many carbs or this many proteins. You need to have a general idea, but having some carbohydrate, some protein, some fat, fruits, veg, all the whole food, plant-based things. So fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, seeds, all those things on the plate. And obviously we don't feel that dairy is necessary on that plate. For meals and snacks, I just try to have that balanced approach. So where could you add a little bit of fruit or a little bit of vegetable, a little bit of healthy fats, and making sure that they have adequate protein. So, for breakfast, if you're going to do a smoothie or oatmeal, having your oats, maybe some nut butter, some fruits, it's really not that complicated. And I think sometimes we make things so complicated, but just getting back to those basics, making sure that the food has a good variety of nutrients and that it tastes good. And for kids, especially, that it's presented in a way that seems appealing and fun for them.
And we've talked about fiber so much on the show, especially from an adult point of view, and, diabetes and kidney disease and all of these other things. And I think that it's important for parents to relate that to their kids too. They need a variety of different types of fibers. You don't need to say to the kids, like, have you had enough fiber today? You just you just do it and you get in that routine. Is there a difference between beans or legumes being processed into a hummus or being put on the plate or being mixed into a smoothie? Is there a difference in that texture of how that bean is being given and how that's going to react in the body? And is it good enough if it is hummus or in the smoothie?
I think the key thing is variety. So one of the things with fiber and young kids you have to remember is that for adults, pretty much the more fiber, the better. It's really difficult to get too much fiber in your diet, but for kids, you can get too much fiber. So especially one of the nutritionally vulnerable periods of time is when kids are starting to, when you're introducing complementary foods. So they're doing less breast milk or formula, especially at a year of age when they're sort of, stopping the formula altogether and perhaps weaning off of breast milk, and they're starting to eat more solid foods. Their stomachs are pretty small. So too much fiber in young kids can actually make it difficult for them to meet their caloric needs. So I actually think having some more sort of processed foods in the form of pastas or hummuses or things like that can make it much easier for kids to meet their caloric requirement. I think eating a variety of foods, whether it's hummus or whole beans or edamame or tofu, I think the key is just variety. For some kids, they may really not like chickpeas, but they'll eat it in a hummus. So just experimenting and not being too rigid with like it must be 100% intact, unprocessed, but just enjoying the food.
I get a question all the time about the older kids, and for families that are transitioning their older teenagers almost, or even if they are teenagers, to a plant-based lifestyle, what are they going to do when they're moving out of the house, going to university, and they're just going to change their diet? How do I get them to continue? I have to instill these values, but they're pushing back. What do you say to those families?
So I think the key word that you used that really kind of frames this whole conversation is, how do I get them to? And the answer is you can't get them to. The most important thing is that you provide them with the tools, and then it's up to them, because you can't force them, right? Like if they're going off to college, if they're going off to university, if they're moving out of the house, you can't control what they eat. And if we've done a good job building that relationship, regardless of what they eat, you're still going to have that sort of loving connection. I think the most important thing parents can do is to provide a variety of foods, to model good behavior, and to create a really nourishing, healthy environment around food and feeding.
So we've talked a lot about what to feed our kids or what to give them, but what about when it's time to cut them off and we want to say, you know what? Too many rice cakes, or no, this is not the time to eat, don't eat now, or that's too much candy. I think that we've learned that no is a dirty word, and parents don't like to use no with kids, but there's also this fear that I think we do need to get over in a certain way, but there's also this fear of we don't want to create eating disorders in our children, and if we deny them the candy, or we deny them the chips, or we deny them the fifth burrito, we don't want to see them be overweight. We don't want to see them feel sick later. Are we going to create a monster? Are we going to create some kind of, maybe not a monster, maybe we could take that out, but are we going to create some kind of eating disorder or some kind of mental health issue because we're telling them no around food?
And I have so much empathy for parents, because I think it can be a really difficult thing. We hear all these messages about heart disease and diabetes and obesity, and the last thing we want to do is to have our children suffer with these things. But studies have shown repeatedly that when parents push kids to eat broccoli, kale, whatever it may be, they eat less. And when parents restrict kids from eating, they eat more. So the best thing that we can really do is to kind of get out of their way. I think if you have certain foods that are creating tension or making a sense of conflict, consider not having those foods in the house. And I don't mean from a restrictive way, like we will have no sugar in the house, we will have no sweets, but we are a family, we don't have soda in the house. Like it's not an issue because it's not in the house. But I think allowing your kids to eat, and a few years ago, I actually took a different approach to Halloween. So we've been plant-based for many years, but when my kids were younger, we weren't fully plant-based. And when they would go trick-or-treating when they were little, there was this idea, like you can only have one or two pieces because that's the rule, and I don't want you to get a stomach ache. And I remember one year I took the advice that many feeding experts had been giving, which is have all the candy you want. Like literally, it's Halloween, you have all the candy you want. And I remember, especially my youngest one looked up at me and he said, "You mean I can eat as much as I want?" I said, "Yep, you can have as much as you want." And when that limit was taken away, he had two pieces and he was done. But the minute that they feel like it might go away, I might not be able to have it, it becomes so much more tantalizing. And I think it really goes against our intuition as parents to say, you can have as much as you want. But the reality is that I think they sort it out themselves. And I think the more tight we are with the regulation and the control, the more prized those foods become. And then you come into situations where kids are either sneaking or they're hiding, or when they do have access to these foods at a friend's house or grandma's house or somewhere else, that it just unleashes this sense of wanting. So I actually don't really, think that restricting kids is it serves them, and it certainly doesn't serve us. It just doesn't feel good. So my youngest is now almost 16, and he's in that sort of growth spurt phase. And sometimes I'm astonished at how much he can eat. And I realize like he needs to eat it. He'll have, 3 servings of whatever I'm making because that's what his nutritional needs and requirements are. And maybe the next day at breakfast, he won't eat so much. So I think if we can back off and kind of let them sort of do what they need to do, it works out well. Now, I'm not saying that that can happen overnight. And I think for parents, one of the best things to do is when that feeling comes up, like, oh my God, I can't believe they're having another helping of this, or, oh my God, I can't believe that, she wants another thing of dessert, is to just notice that feeling and to just acknowledge it. And it's okay. We're parents. We really want the best for our children, and to take a deep breath and to just kind of try and, I know you've talked about this a lot, not have so much emotion around it.
Talk about that feeling. It's also, if they're going to have all these candies at Halloween and eat as much as they want, hopefully they'll recognize and have some awareness around how that made them feel after they had so much of it, so that they remember next time, maybe I won't go all out when I have the opportunity.
And I'll tell you, like, after a while, like, I remember we had to throw out the Halloween candy because it had been so many months and it was still sitting there. So I think, and if those foods cause you a lot of anxiety, I might just think about not having them in the house so it doesn't create that battle.
So let's say you let them have all the because Halloween's around the corner. So let's say we let them have, or maybe it's around the corner. So they have the candy. You pull out so let's say you're plant-based. So you're clearly going to pull out anything with dairy in it, right? So you're going to get rid of all of that, and you let them have what they want, and they keep the rest in the cupboard. And if they want to eat it all in one day, do you say to them like, well, I'm not buying candy for a month, or I'm not buying cookies or anything for the lunchbox for a month. So you decide what you want. Do you want to eat it all in one day and then go a month without candy? Or do you want to kind of ration it out? I'm going to let you decide. Or is that still too controlling?
I think it's too controlling. And I think honestly, with our children, we don't need to have these, they can't make those decisions. Remember, we're responsible for the what, the when, and where. So I think giving them too many choices, they can't think that far out. Well, if I wait, then I might have this in a month. For them, it's just in the moment, very much in the moment. So I think if they sense that we are anxious and worried about what they're going to do with this candy, they are going to be anxious and worried about what they're going to do with their candy. And there's no one right answer for every family. Every family is going to have a different approach. Some families have different rules around candy. So sit with what works for your family and come back to the idea of how can I maintain a loving connection with my child.
Dr. Shah, you have a book with Brenda Davis coming out. It's called Nourish, the Definitive Plant-Based Nutrition Guide for Families. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you and Brenda came together to write this, and let's get everybody to be aware of this book that's coming out in November 2020.
Thank you so much. So Brenda and I met in, I feel like it's like the story of how we met. It's almost kind of like a love connection that we had. So several years ago, this was back in 2016, I was actually on my way to a plant-based conference in Anaheim, California. And as luck would have it, she and I were sitting next to one another on the plane. And I mean, of course, I knew exactly who Brenda was because she's a pioneer in the plant-based world. She's like, she's so humble and so kind. So we're sitting next to one another, and she's got her papers out for the conference because she's going to be one of the presenters. And I sort of smile at her and I say, oh, I'm going to the conference as well. And she introduces herself and she said, oh, I'm Brenda Davis. I'm one of the speakers. And I'm like, I know who you are. And we ended up chatting the whole flight down. We drove back to the airport, to the hotel together, and just sort of struck up a conversation and a friendship. And we sort of stayed in touch. And then the following year, we met again at the conference. And I remember the very last day of the conference, I was sitting next to her at breakfast, and she was just asking her for, professional advice. Like, she's done so much in the plant-based community, and how is it that she did this, especially at a time like 30 years ago when, nobody was vegan, nobody was plant-based. And she said, well, we could work on something together. And I remember on my way home from the airport, I went to the airport and I pulled out my notebook and I started drafting the chapters of the book in that moment. So that's kind of how it came to be. And then it's just been a wonderful collaboration. I've learned so much from her. And we really wanted to write this book, not only for families that are already plant-based, because there's so many families that are already plant-based, they're well on their way, and we wanted to provide the extra layer of support to know that they're meeting their nutritional basis. But we also wanted this book to be for families that were plant curious. So they're thinking about it, but they're just not sure. And we wanted to give them as much support and as much information and resources in order to be able to do this in a successful way.
That's a beautiful story. And put in your mental notes that we want to ask Brenda when we have her back on the show to talk about pre and postnatal care and nutrition, that how they met and how this came apart. And we're going to compare the stories and see what her version is.
Hopefully our memories will be not too different.
I'll eat a couple of extra blueberries so that I remember to ask her for sure. But that is a great story. Before we say goodbye, before we let you go, can you give the listeners a little bit of actionable tips, or actually, can you give the listeners an idea of how they can make sure that their child is thriving on a plant-based diet? And if they do have any feedback from their pediatricians who aren't plant-based and aren't as familiar with it, what do they need to look for to make sure that their child is on the right path?
Okay, so those are all great questions. And the first thing I would say is that the growth chart can be a tool. It's not all the information. Some people just focus on the growth chart and they don't worry about anything else. So the growth chart can be a good indicator of if your child is growing and developing well. So you want to make sure that they're trending along their particular curve. I think people get very invested in the percentile. Well, my kid's 75th percentile or my kid's 25th percentile. And the thing is it matters most where your kid is with regards to his or her own growth. So I'm 5 feet tall. Luckily, my husband's a bit taller. So there's some genetic potential in terms of what our children's growth will be like, but that they're tracking along their growth chart. And any deviation from the growth chart that's significant. So kids don't always follow a curve perfectly. There's going to be a little bit of variability, but if you see a big jump up or a big jump down, those are all reasons to worry about. So the first thing is using the growth chart as a tool, a general indicator of what their growth is. The second thing is like what the child's feelings around food are. Are mealtimes stressful? Are they anxious for mom? Are they anxious for child? Is there a lot of like fighting, battling, conflict? That's one indicator of how feeding is going for a family. So I think mealtime should be fairly relaxed. There shouldn't be, I like to tell parents, focus on the conversation and not how many bites of anything that's being eaten. So if meal times are stressful for mom or dad, or if they're stressful for a child, that's an indication that there's a problem. And then obviously other indicators like regular bowel movements, what their sleep is like, all those other things that we consider when looking at the wellness of the whole child.
Cool. So much great information, Dr. Shah. Thank you so much. We're going to link to the book in our show notes. It's Nourish, the Definitive Plant-Based Nutrition Guide for Families, coming out November 2020. If people want to reach out to you, where would you like them to go?
So the place that I tend to be most active is on Instagram. So it's just my name, Reshma Shah. We also have a website for the book. It's nourishthebook.com. And in addition to like the usual pre-order information, we also have like a lot of resources. We've created like a handy nutrients guide. So certain nutrients that plant-based families might be concerned about and what the plant sources are. We also have a link to the page that the plate that we talked about with the food groups and things. And then I have my own personal website. It's just reshmashahmd.com.
Beautiful.
We will link to all that in the show notes at planttrainers.com. Thank you so much, Dr. Shah, for spending time with us on the Plant Trainers podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful chatting with you.